Hi, and welcome along to the next video in our Kubernetes Security Fundamentals series. In the last video, we took a look at the Kubelet API and talked a bit about how it works and some of the authentication and authorization things you might notice with it. We're going to carry on today and look at some more of the APIs that Kubernetes Components presents. So let's remind ourselves of the diagram and the ports we're talking about. So in the past, we've looked at a number of different ports across different Kubernetes APIs. We've looked at etcd, the Kube API server, and Kubelet. Today, what we're going to do is take a look at some of the less used, less exposed APIs that Kubernetes components run. We're going to look at the controller manager, the scheduler, and kubeproxy. Now, for these components, each of these doesn't actually present services that are really used by users, but they have APIs all the same, and those APIs are primarily there for debugging and monitoring purposes. But they're still present, and from a security and attacker's perspective, there's still things that we want to know about. So what we'll do is let's go across the terminal and actually look at how it works in practice. So we've got our standard kubeadm cluster that we've used for all of our demonstrations so far. And if we do ss-ltmp, we can look and see the ports we've got listening. Now, we've got a couple of things we're going to look at here. We've got 10.257, which is our Kube controller manager. We've got 10.259, which is our scheduler. And then we've got two proxy ports. We've got 10.256, and we have got 10.249. So there's a number of ports and services to look at here. We'll start off with the controller manager. So the controller manager has endpoints listening on localhost by default in kubeadm. Now again, as ever with Kubernetes, this can vary per distribution, but for kubeadm, it's only on localhost, so it's not very exposed. And if we do curl -k https 27.0.0.1, and then we do 102.57, we'll get back a forbidden error message. So this tells us that we need credentials if we want to get to certain API endpoints. And we're saying at the moment, the identity we've been given, which is the anonymous identity, because we've not provided creds, doesn't actually have rights to get that path. So by default, there's not a lot of access to the controller manager API without credentials. The one endpoint you can get is we can get the healthz endpoint. And healthz is basically just a thing to say, hey, is this component up and running? And if we do it, it's a little bit hard to spot, but you can see on the left there, it comes back with OK. So what that basically does is it tells us that the component's up and running OK. So that is the controller manager API. There's not a lot exposed by default there. But if you have credentials, then you might be able to do more with it. It does have some debugging functionality. So we've got the scheduler. So the scheduler is on 10.259. And as you can see, we get back a same response. So the scheduler and the controller manager, their APIs work very similarly. We get the same response back. We haven't given it credentials, so we're just going to get that 403 forbidden error. And as with the controller manager, if we give it the healthz endpoint, we get back OK again. So that's available without authentication, but most of the API components, things like metrics, require authentication. So those two will be available on any control plane nodes. But then we've also got the proxy, the kubeproxy, and it handles things a little bit differently. So this is a component that will run on every worker node and potentially control plane nodes if they're running things inside containers on the control plane nodes. And as we mentioned, if we go back to look at our port listing, we've got two different ports here. So what the proxy does is it splits its API into two different ports. 10.256, as you can see here, is listening on all interfaces. And this presents one API endpoint, one API endpoint only. So if I do, we'll just get it on localhost. Well, we could use other ones. And we go 102.56, and we give it healthz. We'll get back a response. So this is the healthz endpoint for kubeproxy. Somewhat interestingly, you can see it doesn't actually give you just a flat OK in the same way the other two components did. It gives you a little bit more information, but that's there. And that's available unencrypted and without authentication. So if you're looking to fingerprint something and you get to port 10.256, that's a pretty good indication that you've hit a kubeproxy service. The other one is slightly more interesting potentially, which listens in kubeadm on 10.249, and by default it's on localhost, so only visible on localhost. This one has a couple more interesting endpoints. So if we do 10.249, we can do config Z, and we'll pipe that through JQ. Because what that does is actually dumps the configuration of the component. And it does this without authentication, so there's no authentication on it, and without encryption. Now, on kubeadm, this is listening on localhost, but there are some Kubernetes distributions that this listens on all interfaces. So there is a bit of information disclosure here, because if you're listening on all interfaces and you're disclosing things like paths without authentication, that's probably not ideal from a security standpoint. The other thing you can get on that endpoint is you can get metrics. So all of the metrics for various parts of the service are available here. These are typically picked up by Prometheus services to help you monitor your kubeproxy components. And again, this is only available on localhost, although it is available without authentication. But some Kubernetes distributions might have this as being available on all interfaces. So again, you've got a bit of information disclosure here. There's quite a lot of things you might be able to derive from what's going on with the service. And you can see there's a lot of information in there. So you can kind of go looking through there if it's something that's of interest. So those are a little bit of information about the other 3 APIs that we've got in standard kubeadm Kubernetes clusters. And what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to start looking at Kubernetes authentication and how you authenticate to both the main API server and the other components that there are in a cluster. As ever, if you'd like more information, you can find that on our Security Lab site, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.